Sometimes the truth reveals itself in the smallest moments. A flicker of expression across a familiar face. A hesitation where there should be curiosity. A carefully controlled response to something unexpected. I learned this on a Tuesday morning in March when our contractor knocked on the kitchen door with news about a discovery in our basement, and I watched my husband's face transform in a way that told me our entire marriage had been built on lies. We'd bought the house 18 months earlier, a beautiful Victorian in a historic neighborhood that needed more work than we'd anticipated. My husband Marcus had been enthusiastic about the project from the beginning, insisting we could handle the renovations ourselves with just occasional professional help. I'd been hesitant about taking on such a massive project, but Marcus had been so confident, so excited, that I'd let myself be swept along by his enthusiasm. The basement renovation was the last major project on our list. We'd finished the main floors, updated the kitchen and bathrooms, refinished the hardwood floors upstairs. Now we were finally tackling the basement, converting it from a dark, cluttered storage space into a proper family room and home office. We'd hired Dave, a contractor who came highly recommended by our neighbors, to handle the structural work while we managed the cosmetic updates ourselves. That Tuesday morning, I was working from home, trying to focus on a report due by end of day while construction noise echoed up from below. Marcus had left early for a business trip to Chicago, kissing me goodbye at 6 in the morning and reminding me to text him updates about the basement progress. He'd been particularly interested in this phase of the renovation, checking in constantly, asking detailed questions about timelines and plans. Around 10:30, I heard footsteps coming up the basement stairs, heavier and slower than usual. Dave appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression a mixture of confusion and excitement. He was covered in dust, holding a crowbar, and there was something in his demeanor that made me set down my coffee mug and give him my full attention. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "I think you need to come see something." I followed him down to the basement, where his 2 crew members stood near the far wall, the one we'd planned to frame out for the home office. They'd been removing old paneling all morning, pulling away layers of wood and drywall that had been installed decades ago. But now they'd stopped working, and all 3 men were staring at the wall with expressions of bewildered curiosity. Where the paneling had been, there was now exposed brick. But it wasn't a solid wall. Set into the brick was a door, or rather, the outline of a door. It had been sealed with concrete, filled in so carefully that it had been invisible under the paneling. But the outline was clear now, showing where a doorway had once existed, approximately 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. "We found it about 20 minutes ago," Dave explained. "Looks like someone went to a lot of trouble to seal this up and hide it. The paneling over it was newer than the rest, maybe 30 years old, and it was installed specifically to cover this section of wall." I stepped closer, running my fingers along the sealed doorway. The concrete was smooth, professionally done, not a hasty patch job. Someone had taken time and care to eliminate this doorway, to make it disappear completely. "What do you think is back there?" I asked. Dave shrugged. "Could be anything. Sometimes old houses have storage spaces that got sealed off, or maybe there was structural damage and this was easier than repairing it. Or it could be nothing at all, just a doorway that led to a crawl space someone decided they didn't need." He paused, then added, "Want us to open it?" My first instinct was to call Marcus. This was exactly the kind of discovery that would excite him, and he'd want to be here when we opened it. I pulled out my phone to text him, already composing the message in my head. But something made me stop. I thought about how intensely interested Marcus had been in the basement renovation, how he'd insisted on hiring the contractor himself, how he'd been very specific about the timeline and the scope of work. I thought about how he'd wanted to be present for every phase of the basement work, how frustrated he'd been that this business trip conflicted with the demolition schedule. "Yes," I heard myself say. "Open it." Dave nodded and turned to his crew. They began chipping away at the concrete, working carefully to avoid damaging the brick surrounding the sealed doorway. I stood back and watched, my phone still in my hand, trying to ignore the growing sense that something was wrong, that I was about to discover something I didn't want to know. It took them almost an hour to remove enough concrete to reveal what was behind it. The doorway, once cleared, opened into darkness. Dave shone his flashlight into the space beyond, and I heard him draw in a sharp breath. "It's a room," he said quietly. "A whole room, completely sealed off." I moved forward to look. The flashlight beam revealed a space about 15 feet square, with brick walls and a concrete floor. But it wasn't empty. Even from the doorway, I could see furniture inside. A desk, a filing cabinet, shelves along one wall. And everything was covered with a thick layer of dust, untouched for what looked like decades. "Should we go in?" Dave asked, but I was already stepping through the doorway. The air inside was stale and cold, somehow different from the rest of the basement. It felt like entering a tomb, a place that had been closed off from the world for so long that even the atmosphere had changed. Dave and his crew followed me in, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating more details. The room had clearly been someone's workspace, set up deliberately and then abandoned. The desk was wooden, solid and well-made, with a chair pushed up against it as if someone had just stood up and walked away. The filing cabinet beside it was metal, old-fashioned, with 4 drawers. The shelves held books, binders, and boxes, all organized with a precision that suggested purpose and planning. On the desk was a leather blotter, a lamp, and a telephone that looked like it was from the 1980s. There were also photographs in frames, their glass surfaces clouded with dust. I picked one up and wiped it clean. It showed a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with dark curly hair and a bright smile. She was standing in front of what looked like this very house, and the photograph appeared to be from 30 or 40 years ago based on the clothing and the color quality. I didn't recognize her, but something about the photo made my skin prickle with unease. Dave was examining the filing cabinet. "Should I?" he asked, gesturing to the drawers. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He opened the top drawer. Inside were hanging files, dozens of them, all neatly labeled. He pulled one out at random and opened it. It contained newspaper clippings, police reports, and handwritten notes. Dave's expression changed as he read, confusion giving way to something darker. "Mrs. Chen," he said carefully, "I think maybe you should call the police." "Why?" I asked, but I was already reaching for another file, already reading the tab that said, "Disappearance, Timeline." The file contained exactly what the label suggested. A detailed timeline, spanning from August 1987 to December 1988, documenting someone's investigation into a disappearance. There were dates, locations, interviews with witnesses, theories about what might have happened. The handwriting was meticulous, almost obsessive, filling page after page with observations and conclusions. The name that appeared throughout the file was Jennifer Morrison, the young woman who'd disappeared. And as I read through the pages, a sick feeling began growing in my stomach. I moved to the shelves and started pulling down binders. They were organized by year, each one containing more documentation about Jennifer Morrison. There were surveillance notes, detailing her routines and habits. There were photographs, dozens of them, showing her at work, at home, with friends, unaware she was being watched. There were maps with locations marked and routes traced. And there were theories, pages and pages of theories about her life, her relationships, her vulnerabilities. This wasn't a simple investigation. This was an obsession. "Mrs. Chen," Dave said again, his voice more urgent. "We really need to call the police. Right now." But I was reading something else now, something that made my hands shake. A journal entry, dated December 15th, 1988, written in a hand I was beginning to recognize despite the years that had passed since it was written. "I can't do this anymore. The guilt is destroying me. Every time I see her face in the news, every time her family pleads for information, I feel like I'm suffocating. But I can't come forward. I can't admit what I did, what I saw, what I didn't stop. So I'm sealing this room. I'm closing this door and filling it with concrete and covering it over so that I never have to look at any of this again. Maybe if I can't see it, I can learn to forget. Maybe I can build a normal life, find someone to love, have a family, be the person I should have been instead of the person I became." The handwriting was Marcus's. Younger, less controlled, but unmistakably his. I stood in that sealed room, surrounded by evidence of an obsession I'd never suspected, and I felt my entire reality shifting beneath my feet. The man I'd been married to for 6 years, the man I'd trusted and built a life with, had been someone completely different before I knew him. He'd been obsessed with a woman who'd disappeared. And based on what I was reading, he knew something about that disappearance that he'd never told anyone. Dave was on his phone, calling the police despite my silence. I heard him talking to a dispatcher, explaining about the sealed room, the files, the need for someone to come investigate. But his voice seemed far away, distant, like I was hearing it through water. I pulled out my own phone. There were 3 text messages from Marcus, sent over the past hour while I'd been in the basement. "How's the demo going? Dave making good progress. Let me know if anything interesting turns up." That last message felt different now. Not casual curiosity but barely concealed anxiety. He'd known there was a possibility the room would be discovered. That's why he'd wanted to be here, why he'd been so controlling about the renovation timeline. He'd been hoping to be present when it was found, hoping to control the narrative, to shape the story before anyone else could see the truth. I called him. He answered on the second ring, his voice bright and cheerful. "Hey babe, how's it going?" "They found a room," I said flatly. "A sealed room behind the basement wall." The silence that followed was deafening. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was different, careful and controlled. "What kind of room?" "You know what kind of room," I said. "You sealed it yourself, didn't you? Back in 1988. Another silence, longer this time. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him running calculations, deciding how much to admit, how much to deny. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," he finally said. "Don't let anyone take anything from that room. Don't let them read the files or remove any documents. I'm getting on the next flight home. We'll talk about this when I get there. The police are coming," I told him. Dave already called them. I heard something crash in the background, like he'd thrown something or knocked something over. Fuck. Okay. Listen, when they get there, tell them you don't know anything. Tell them you just bought the house, you've never been in that room, you have no idea what any of it means. Don't volunteer information. Don't speculate. Just say you don't know. "What did you do, Marcus?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What did you do to Jennifer Morrison?" "I didn't do anything," he said quickly, too quickly. "I swear to God, I didn't hurt her. But I know things I should have told the police back then but didn't. And if that comes out now, it's going to look bad. Really bad. So please, just don't say anything until I get there." He kept talking, trying to convince me to stay quiet, to wait, to trust him. But I was barely listening. I was looking at another photograph I'd found, this one showing Marcus and Jennifer together, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling. He looked so young in the photo, maybe 22 or 23, and completely different from the man I knew. There was something in his eyes in this picture, something intense and unsettling. The police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 detectives, both middle-aged, both with the worn expressions of people who'd seen too much. Dave met them at the door and brought them down to the basement, explaining what they'd found. I stood aside and watched them process the scene, their initial curiosity transforming into grim professional focus as they began understanding what they were looking at. Detective Sarah Chin, no relation to me despite the shared surname, was the one who did most of the talking. She asked me careful questions about the house, about how long we'd owned it, about whether I'd known the room existed. I answered honestly, telling her we'd bought it 18 months ago, that we'd never been in the basement much until now, that I'd had no idea any of this was here. Been in the basement much until now, that I'd had no idea any of this was here. "And your husband?" she asked. "Where is he now?" "Business trip. Chicago. He's flying back tonight." She nodded, making notes. How long have you been married? 6 years. We met at a conference in Boston. Do you know if your husband has any connection to Jennifer Morrison? Any history in this area before you met him? I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I think you should ask him that directly, I finally said. Detective Chen's expression sharpened. She knew evasion when she heard it. Mrs. Chen, if you know something relevant to this case, you need to tell us. A woman disappeared 36 years ago. Her family has never had closure. If there's information in this room that could help them, we need to know about it. So I told her. About recognizing Marcus's handwriting, about the journal entry, about the phone call where he'd basically admitted knowing something about Jennifer Morrison's disappearance that he'd never disclosed. I showed them the photographs of Marcus and Jennifer together. And I watched their faces as they realized they weren't just looking at an old cold case but at an active investigation into a man who'd hidden evidence for decades. The next several hours were surreal. More police arrived, including crime scene technicians who began carefully documenting and removing everything from the sealed room. I was interviewed multiple times, answering the same questions over and over. They asked about Marcus's behavior, his habits, whether he'd ever been violent or controlling. They asked about our relationship, how we'd met, whether he'd ever mentioned Jennifer Morrison or seemed anxious about this house renovation. I answered everything honestly, but the truth was I realized I didn't really know my husband at all. The man I'd married was apparently capable of obsessing over someone to the point of surveillance and documentation, capable of keeping crucial information about a missing person case hidden for decades, capable of sealing up a room full of evidence and then building a normal life on top of that secret. Marcus arrived home around 8 that evening. Police were still at the house, still processing the basement. I was sitting in the living room with Detective Chen when I heard his key in the lock. He walked in, saw the police, and his face went carefully blank. Marcus Chen? Detective Chen asked, standing up. Yes. I'm Detective Sarah Chen. I need to ask you some questions about Jennifer Morrison and the sealed room in your basement. I watched him closely, looking for any sign of the man I thought I knew. But his expression remained neutral, controlled, giving nothing away. I'd like to speak with my lawyer before answering any questions, he said. It was the right thing to say legally, but it confirmed everything I'd been fearing. An innocent person would ask questions, would show confusion or curiosity. Marcus's immediate request for a lawyer told me he'd been expecting this, preparing for it, probably for decades. That's your right, Detective Chen said. But I should inform you that we're executing a search warrant for this property and will need you to come down to the station for a formal interview once your lawyer is present. Marcus nodded, still calm, still controlled. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and for just a moment I saw something crack in that carefully maintained facade. Regret, maybe. Or fear. Or just the realization that the life he'd built was collapsing around him. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For all of this. You didn't deserve to find out this way. What did you do? I asked, the same question I'd asked on the phone, still hoping for an answer that would make sense. I'll tell you everything, he promised. After I talk to my lawyer, after I figure out how to explain it. But I need you to know that I never hurt her. Whatever you think you know from reading those files, whatever conclusions you're drawing, I didn't hurt Jennifer Morrison. But you know what happened to her, Detective Chen said. It wasn't a question. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they were filled with a weariness that aged him 20 years. Yes, he admitted. I know what happened to her. The police took him to the station that night. I stayed home, unable to be in the house but unable to leave it either. I sat in the kitchen and tried to process everything I'd learned in the span of a single day. The contractor's crew had long since left, Dave promising to call tomorrow about whether we wanted to continue the renovation. As if that mattered now. As if I'd ever be able to live in this house again, knowing what had been hidden in its walls. Over the next several days, the story emerged in pieces, revealed through police interviews, legal proceedings, and one long, painful conversation with Marcus after his lawyer finally allowed him to speak with me. The truth was complicated, messy, and somehow worse than I'd imagined. Marcus and Jennifer Morrison had dated briefly in college. It had been intense and passionate, at least for Marcus. Jennifer had apparently seen it as a casual relationship, something fun but not serious. When she'd tried to break up with him, Marcus had taken it badly. Instead of moving on, he'd become obsessed, unable to accept that it was over. He'd followed her after graduation, getting a job in the same city where she'd settled. He'd watched her, documented her life, convinced himself that if he could just understand her perfectly, he'd be able to win her back. The sealed room was his command center, the place where he'd organized his obsession into binders and files and carefully cross-referenced notes. On the night Jennifer disappeared in December 1988, Marcus had been following her. He'd watched her leave a bar with friends, watched her say goodbye to them and walk toward her apartment. And he'd watched a car pull up beside her, watched her talk to whoever was inside, watched her get into that car willingly. It had driven away with her inside, and Marcus had never seen her again. He claimed he didn't know who was in the car, didn't recognize the vehicle. But he'd been paralyzed by the realization of what he'd been doing, struck suddenly by how his behavior looked from the outside. He wasn't a concerned ex-boyfriend trying to make sure Jennifer was safe. He was a stalker, someone who'd been following and monitoring a woman who'd made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him. So he'd made a choice. He'd kept quiet about what he'd seen. He'd told himself that Jennifer had probably gone willingly with someone she knew, that she was fine, that speaking up would only expose his own disturbing behavior without helping anyone. He'd waited for news that she was okay, that she'd just taken a spontaneous trip or decided to start over somewhere new. But she was never found. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still no Jennifer. Her family appeared on the news, desperate for information. Police investigated but found no leads. And Marcus said nothing, paralyzed by guilt and fear and the knowledge that coming forward would reveal the extent of his obsession. Eventually, unable to live with the physical evidence of what he'd done, he'd sealed the room. He'd covered his obsession in concrete and drywall, literally burying his past. Then he'd moved to a different city, built a new life, became someone different. He'd met me, married me, bought this house without ever telling me it had once been the site of his greatest shame. Why this house? I'd asked him during our conversation, my voice hollow. Of all the houses in the world, why did you bring me back here? I thought I could handle it, he said, not meeting my eyes. I thought enough time had passed. And honestly, part of me wanted to face it, to prove to myself that I'd moved on. But then when we started planning the basement renovation, when I realized there was a chance the room could be discovered, I panicked. I tried to control the process, tried to make sure I'd be there when it was found, but I couldn't stop it from happening. The legal proceedings took months. Marcus was eventually charged with obstruction of justice and withholding evidence in a missing person case. His testimony about seeing Jennifer get into a car that night gave police a new lead to investigate, though 36 years cold made finding answers difficult. They reopened the case, re-interviewed witnesses, tried to piece together what might have happened based on Marcus's account. Jennifer's family had mixed reactions. They were grateful for any new information, desperate after decades of not knowing. But they were also angry that Marcus had stayed silent for so long, that his cowardice had potentially prevented them from finding answers when the trail was still warm. Jennifer's sister confronted me at one of the hearings, demanding to know how I could have been married to someone like Marcus without knowing what he was capable of. I didn't have a good answer for her. The truth was I hadn't known, but maybe I should have. There had been signs I'd missed or ignored. The way Marcus sometimes seemed distant, like he was carrying weight I couldn't see. His reluctance to talk about his past, his college years, the decade before we met. His intense need for control over certain aspects of our life, including this house renovation. I'd attributed it all to personality quirks, never imagining there was a sealed room full of secrets explaining everything. I filed for divorce before the criminal trial concluded. I couldn't stay married to someone who'd hidden such a fundamental truth about who they were. Marcus didn't contest it, didn't fight me on any aspect of the separation. I think he understood that what we'd had was built on a foundation that had turned out to be quicksand. The house went up for sale. I couldn't live there, couldn't even stay in the city. I moved across the country, started over somewhere where no one knew my story. But I couldn't escape the questions that haunted me. How do you trust your judgment when you've been so completely wrong about someone? How do you open yourself to love again when you've learned that people can hide enormous secrets behind familiar faces? Marcus was eventually sentenced to 3 years in prison for obstruction of justice. It was less than the prosecutor wanted, but more than his lawyer had hoped for. The judge noted that while Marcus hadn't committed the actual crime of Jennifer's disappearance, his silence had significantly hampered the investigation and denied her family closure for decades. The information Marcus provided did eventually lead to new developments in Jennifer's case. Police identified several people who'd owned cars matching the description Marcus gave, and one of them became a person of interest when other evidence connected him to Jennifer. There was talk of finally bringing charges, of potentially solving a case that had been cold for decades. Jennifer's family reached out to me once more after Marcus's sentencing. Her sister apologized for her earlier anger, acknowledging that I'd been a victim of Marcus's deception too. We had a long, difficult conversation about secrets and lies and the people we think we know. She told me that while they'd never forgive Marcus for his silence, they understood I'd been just as blindsided as they were. I think about that Tuesday morning often, about the moment Dave came up from the basement to tell me about the hidden door. I think about how my life split into before and after in the time it took to chisel away concrete and reveal what had been hidden. And I think about Marcus's face when I told him about the discovery, that carefully controlled expression that told me everything I needed to know. Because here's what I learned: the truth has a way of emerging eventually, no matter how carefully you seal it away. You can brick it up, cover it in concrete, hide it behind walls and years and carefully constructed normalcy. But it's still there, waiting. And when it finally emerges into the light, it doesn't come alone. It brings with it all the consequences of hiding, all the damage done by silence, all the years of choosing concealment over courage. The contractor found a hidden door in our basement, and my husband's reaction told me everything. Not what he said, but what he didn't say. Not his curiosity, but his controlled lack of it. Not his questions, but his carefully calculated responses. In that moment, before I even knew the details, I understood that the man I'd married had been living with a secret so large that he'd had to physically seal it away to live with himself. And now I live with my own secrets, my own shame about having been so blind. I live with the knowledge that I shared my life with someone whose past contained such darkness that he'd literally bricked it into a wall. I live with questions about my own judgment, my own ability to see people clearly, my own capacity to trust. But I also live with a commitment to truth, to facing reality even when it's painful, to never again accepting surface appearances without questioning what might lie beneath. The hidden door in the basement taught me that we all have the capacity to conceal, to compartmentalize, to build new lives on top of buried pasts. And it taught me that secrets, no matter how well hidden, have a way of revealing themselves eventually. The truth was always there, sealed behind concrete in our basement. It took a contractor's routine demolition to bring it into the light. But even without that discovery, I believe it would have emerged eventually. Secrets that large create pressure, distortions in the fabric of ordinary life. And I think, looking back, that I'd been feeling those distortions without understanding what they meant. The slight tension in Marcus's shoulders when basement renovations were discussed. The excessive interest in construction timelines. The business trip that seemed almost deliberately timed to coincide with demolition. He'd known the truth was there, waiting. And part of him had probably wanted it to be found, wanted the relief of finally putting down a burden he'd carried for decades. But another part of him had tried desperately to control the narrative, to be present when discovery happened, to shape the story before anyone else could see the evidence. In the end, his reaction told me everything. The careful control, the immediate lawyer request, the practiced calm of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for 36 years. He'd known exactly what that hidden door meant, because he'd sealed it himself. And in the split second between being told about the discovery and formulating his response, His face had shown everything he'd been hiding. Sometimes we think we know the people we love. We think marriage means understanding someone completely, that years together reveal all there is to know. But the truth is more complicated. People contain depths we can't see, histories they don't share, versions of themselves that existed before we met them. And sometimes those hidden selves are sealed away behind metaphorical doors, bricked up and covered over, maintained as secret spaces that no one else is meant to access. The contractor found a hidden door in our basement. My husband's reaction told me everything. And my life split into before and after, divided by the moment when I realized the man I loved was a stranger hiding behind a familiar face. That's the story I carry now, the truth I learned the hard way. And it's a truth I'll never forget, even as I try to build a new life on foundations that I hope are more solid than the ones that crumbled beneath me that Tuesday morning in March.